Good morning, Year 5. So today we're going to be looking at our third topic lesson around World War One, and we're going to be focusing on women and how their lives changed during that period. Obviously, we know during the war, a lot of men went to fight in the front line, which meant they left a lot of jobs behind, and these jobs had to be filled by women. So we're going to be looking at three key main bits. We're going to look at the women's lives before the war, during the war, and then after the war to see how much it changed. So we're going to start off with before the war. So before the war, the opportunities were very limited. Only about 30% of the workforce was female, and most unmarried working women worked as servants, usually to men. This was because most employers would not let married women work for them, because in those times, especially in the 1920s, in those times, women their role was very much to be at home, doing the house jobs at home, making sure cleaning, cooking for their husbands, and looking after any children. And again, so the house job would include like washing, so washing the dishes, washing clothes, ironing, sewing, making clothes, childcare. So a lot of the jobs that women did were housebound, and they weren't allowed to go out for work because that was seen as a man's job to go out for work. They also were not allowed to vote in any elections. So in 1918, 1914, when the war started, before the war, they were not allowed to vote in any election. So their voice was not heard. So women very much were treated unequally before the war started. Those who did work outside the home were thought not to be as strong, so they were thought to be a little bit weaker. But they often work as teachers, governesses, or nannies. Some were nurses, but not many. And again, not many were doctors because, again, that was seen as a man's job. They did sometimes work in offices, but if they did, they'll be assistants to a man. So they won't be doing because they thought they won't be as good. They worked in factories, but they could only use some of the machine, as it was assumed they would not be strong enough to use it. So again, it's not being treated very equally, and there was a whole thing of the men are better than the women, so the men need to have better jobs, so we can stay at home and do all that, which obviously, back looking at it now, looks a bit bad. So this is going to be the first sheet. So this should be on the website. And we're going to look at the first column. So I'm going to do jobs in the home, jobs outside the home, and other rights. So what I want you to do is pause this video and see if you can fill this sheet out. Go back to the start of the video if you need to, because I have covered quite a lot of this in these two flips here. And all I need to do is, what were some of the jobs in the home that to do? If they could get jobs outside the home, what were some of those jobs? And what were their rights? So were they allowed to vote? So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to fill that out. And then we will move on to what happened during the war. Right, so obviously, when the war began, a lot of this changed because a lot of the men went off to war. A lot of jobs had to be filled by women. So, as well as doing their normal jobs of all the households, looking after children, cooking, cleaning, sewing, they also had to start doing jobs the men had done as they had gone to war. Simply managing their homes, though, was a little more difficult because the men went to war, which it meant there was less money coming in, and many types of food were rationed because obviously supplies were quite poor because a lot of money was being spent on the war effort, which meant food became very expensive to buy, and there was not a lot of it going around, which meant ration just means you were only allowed a certain amount of it, otherwise it would run out. Because frankly there was not enough to go around. So There's a huge number of jobs that women had to take over. As war went on, there were fewer and fewer men available to work. So we've got fishing, we've got telephone operator, we've got farming, teaching in schools, delivering post, shop assistants, and factory work. So all these things women suddenly had to do. So normally women would be, as we found out before, over here on this bit, the women often used, or what often were teachers. So a traditional job would be teaching in schools, and possibly a telephone operator. But factory work, that was mainly a man's job. Fishing was mainly a man's job. Farming was mainly a man's job. Shopping assistant could be a woman's job as well. And delivering post, again, mainly a man's job because a lot of letters and it was quite heavy. Now, women often got paid around half of what men were paid to do these jobs. That is because, again, women were thought to be weaker than men, and the men would do a better job. So the government promised to let women vote once the war was over. But during the war, women got paid a lot less than men because people thought that they couldn't do as much as a man, which obviously isn't very ideal. There were also jobs that were created because of the war. Many women, known as the munitionettes, munition is just what they use in the war, so like guns, bombs, worked in factories making bullets, bombs and missiles for the war. This was, however, very dangerous because the explosive materials sometimes resulted in accidents, killing or injuring the workers. The chemical often made the skin turn yellow, so they were nicknamed canaries. Canary is just another, it's a synonym for yellow, after the yellow bird. But hundreds of women died after being exposed to chemical without suitable protection. So they were trying to help in this war effort, but it was very, very dangerous, and they weren't even offered a suitable level of protection because they were women. So this is what it would look like. So you can see the women here making the bombs. That's what a canary looked like. You can see a yellow bird down at the bottom. So you can see all these women making bullets for a war effort. This poster is called propaganda. It's trying to get women to do something. So these women are doing their bit. Learn to make munitions. So it's trying to recruit women to make munition for the men. So you can also see it. So in usual times, women would not be seen in these factories. It would be a man's area. So it was quite a thing to see women in factories doing all this. So many women also volunteered for the Women's Land Army, which was set up in 1915 as a response to a lack of farm workers, because again, they went to war. There was by the end of the war, there was about 20,000 of these, as well as 250,000 paid labourers on the farm. So about 250,000 workers plus about 20,000 volunteers. At first, the males thought the females would not be very good at it because they were weaker, but they were soon proved wrong. And this proved to be so popular that this happened again during World War II. So again, it's women proving the men wrong, which happens quite a lot. So again, here's women working on the farms, doing all the jobs that men thought they couldn't do because they were weak. But obviously, these women have proved to men that they're not in fact weak, they are strong and they can do it regardless, which is very impressive. So, before the war began, there were around 120 women working as nurses across the country. Once that began, more were needed. Not just in the country, but on the front line as well. So not just in England or Britain, but in France as well on the front line. So when the soldiers got shot, the nurses would help protect them. Many people with large, big houses turned their homes into hospitals. So that was room to treat. There was room to treat the soldiers because there was that many getting hurt during the war, and hospitals being overrun. So houses were often turned into little hospitals to make sure they cope with it. So yeah, as you can see, as you can imagine, that doesn't sound very nice. The rich owners of the homes often tried to arrange entertainment for the men to help them recover. So again, these are the nurses, either in England or on the front line, helping the men recover and get better. So again, we're going to look at the second column now. So we got jobs in the home during the war. So even though they were out of work, they still had to work at home. What sort of jobs are they doing outside of the home now? And what the right side to think here, think about the pay situation. Think about how much they're getting paid compared to the men. What sort of jobs now are they doing outside the home, and are they still working in home? Again, pause it here. If you want to go back a little bit, go back. Because I'm quite conscious about how much I'm talking. I don't want to talk too much, so I think. But go back. So again, munitionettes. Munitionettes is just people who make bullets, bombs, and missiles. Women who make bullets, bombs, and missiles. So again, pause the video, and we're now going to go through the middle column about what they did during the war at home, outside the home, and the other rights as well. Right, so after the war, we're going to find out if they kept their rights or if they lost some. So after 4 years of women stepping up and being able to a lot of these jobs, unfortunately, when the men came back, a lot of these women were sacked because again, the men came back, so they needed jobs for the men, so they sacked the women and they got the men in instead. The women did try to find other jobs within new skills, but they were criticised because it was deemed as them taking a job from a soldier, which in those times was deemed a very bad thing. But as you can see, it's a woman just trying to have a job, and there should be nothing wrong with that. They weren't allowed to have unemployment benefits. That just means if you haven't got a job, the government will give you a certain amount of money to help you survive, because now the men were back, the women were going back to their domestic work, so back to their housework, so back to cooking meals, back to ironing, and back to staying inside all day cleaning. They weren't allowed to have a man's job anymore, or a perceived man's job anymore, so that they go back to the house and carry on with what they did before the war, because they weren't allowed men's job. If they tried to go for men's jobs, they were criticised, and they weren't given money to be unemployed either, because a lot of men died in the war. So their husbands might have died, but they couldn't get an unemployment benefit because they're a woman, which is not nice. So they argued for equal pay because, as you remember, the women were paid half as much as men. Even though the government agreed to equal pay for equal work, they refused to accept. They couldn't possibly accept that women could actually do the same as men. Thankfully, today it's a little bit different. We're still a little bit behind, but it's getting better. The unemployment benefit, as I mentioned earlier, if women did get it, they would also receive less because people thought that they did less work, so they were entitled to less. The government did, however, partially keep its promise to give women the vote. However, you were only allowed to vote if they were over the age of 30. So it's the government giving a little bit, but not very much. Eventually, over 10 years later, with the voting age for women was lowered to 21, which at the time was equal to men. So it took them over 10 years to get equality with men just with being able to vote. So you can see their life before the war, during the war, and after the war were very different periods in time. So again, jobs in the home after the war jobs outside the home after the war, and the other right. So here, think about the votes. Here, think about what jobs did he get outside the home, or why couldn't he get any, and what jobs were he going back to after the war in home. And I look forward to seeing some of these examples when you send them to me via my email, which, if you can remember, should be on the website as well. Obviously, we've moved on a lot in the last 100 years or so, so the situation's got slightly better, but there is still some inequality, which we are striving to get better at. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you hopefully on Monday.